knowing what you care about for this world and making sure that anything you build also contributes to that purpose in some ways, whether that is diversity, whether that is income inequality, whether that is just putting time back in people's lives. But I think this world needs a lot more of founders and ideas and innovation that has a really true purpose and a true north behind it.
Hi there, I'm Bex Craig and you're listening to the Not Just Anything podcast for women who want it whole. I hope you'll join me each week as we hear extraordinary stories from women around the world about how they have curated a whole life by design rather than by default. And for our last interview of season 1, I could not be more thrilled to share that today I'm speaking with Maya Hari, who is the VP of Global Strategy and Operations for Twitter. When I launched this podcast, Maya was the first person that I thought of to have on this show, as I feel incredibly blessed to not only call her a friend, but she is easily one of the most inspirational females and female leaders that I'm privileged enough to know. Maya brings a wealth of global leadership experience, but is also one of those amazing humans whose passion for life and for making a difference is really evident to all who know her and her community around. So I couldn't think of a better person to round up our first season than Maya. She really is an incredible human. Grab a notebook, hold on to your hats, and get ready for the inspiration that is Maya Hari. A huge warm welcome to the fabulous Maya Hari, who is joining me in Singapore today. Maya, it's such a treat to have you here. It is honestly such a privilege. Thanks for making the time.
Not at all. So good to do this with you, Bex. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Usually we get stuck in with what is a big question, but a question which is basically the idea that we are all created and have been created by the experiences of our life and about the peaks and the troughs. And so how would you describe the person that you are today and tell us a little bit about the story that has been the making of you?
That is a big question. Okay, let's get stuck in then. I think for me, everything goes back to origin story. And origin story for me really goes back to how different my parents were from each other. And my dad was actually incredibly left-brained, incredibly liberal, forward-thinking, never brought me up any different than he would a girl or a guy, and taught me independence from, the age of 6 or 7. And my mom was like super creative, but super disorganized in some way, but like creative chaos. But she had the freedom to dream, and she would think big and she would think limitless. And nothing seemed too big. And, these two influences, I sort of find strands of them. I'm not exactly like them, but I find strands of them. And to me, it always goes back to this origin story of the influences that our parents give us, both genetically, but also upbringing and nurturing. And so I actually grew up in India, and I enjoyed sort of exploring throughout my life the whole aspect of being independent, being analytical, but also being creative. And so growing up, I loved maths, I loved chess, but I also aspired to be like an interior designer and a textile designer. So none of it ever made sense growing up. Okay, I have to tell you that. And so people would think, oh, you've spoken to your mom today or you've spoken to your dad today, and who's influenced you? But genuinely, there were both these tracks that kept playing out in my head and in my life. And I think the one thing that I'm very grateful for is the belief that I can be ambitious and I can want what I want. And there's no aspersion of judgment or otherwise that I grew up with. And so that's been really exciting. I am an engineer by background, and then I ended up doing a bunch of writing in my personal time. I did a bunch of representing of artists. So you can see this whole theme of person working in tech, but also having all these things that I've dabbled in my weekends to keep both sides of my spirit alive in some sense. And that has essentially what made me. I realized much later, and I was able to articulate this better, that I need influences in my left brain and my right brain to keep me whole and keep me intact. And I've enjoyed living around the world. I've had a career in technology, but I've increasingly picked companies that I have worked for that I feel like give me a chance to storytell in a way that bring the business side and the storytelling side together. And Twitter is where I am today, and the last 7 years has been a lovely canvas to bring the whole me in some ways.
Oh, what a beautiful place to start. And also, I love the way that you frame this, and it makes so much sense knowing you, that you describe that there are these elements that are so intrinsically within you, both from a nature nurture point of view, that you need to call on to really feel. You said the word whole, which I absolutely love. And so what do you describe as a whole life for yourself?
For me, I think whole, it used to be in the past years when I was younger, I think very, very skewed towards career, but having these things I dabble on the side, right? The way I described it. To me today, the whole life actually has a few different components. It has the family and the kids. It has the work and the ambition. It has I love gardening, and I love plants and art. And so it's being able to make enough time to have those be significant parts of my life. But also increasingly, it's been about what is the legacy and what is the impact that I want to leave, even if in a small and tiny way in my daily life. And so I now think about my whole life with all of these components built in. And, each of those components actually reinforces keeping me who I am. What I learned from gardening in a big way was patience. I never had the patience in my life, and you can't rush a plant to grow in some ways. And so I'm like, but that patience then gives me the strength and resilience to be a better leader to my people in my teams. And so in a way, this whole life works because they all reinforce each other in a great way, I feel.
Yeah, it sounds like one sort of fuels the other. And it's funny because as you're talking, I'm thinking like there's an energy that's giving to you as well, right? There's something that then can give in you. And you touched on legacy. So I sort of feel like you're handing me sort of surfing balls here. So what do you think about in terms of your legacy, your vision, the purpose that you have for your life?
Yeah, I have to say, if I'm absolutely honest, I'm still discovering those pieces. And I don't say that I have all the answers yet on what I want my legacy to be. I'd love to write someday. I'd love to be able to speak to large audiences, to be able to drive change in things that I believe in. Today, a lot of what I believe in stem around the fact that, I'd love to see equality in society or equanimity in society in some ways. And that could be gender, but it could be race, it could be other things. And I've realized over time and years that that's something I deeply and passionately believe in. And so there's a lot of my own effort I'd love to put in there. The other part for me is legacy around the planet. And it's a funny way you realize what you really care about, right? You think you know what you care about, but it reveals itself to you over time in life. My daughter is 13 at the moment, you know her. And when she was 8, her school kids were all sort of learning about what Greta Thunberg was talking about, and they were learning about climate in school. And she came back and she felt very distraught about how we were ruining the planet as humanity. And she just felt helpless that we couldn't do anything about it. The problem seemed so large that she felt like she couldn't do enough about it. And so we broke down the problem and we said, hey, if we can tackle one small piece, which is the ozone, layer and the carbon problem we have, we said, let's just inspire people to plant, and let's do it in a small scale, and let's just do it in the circles around us. And that's how, my own passion towards sustainability in some ways started, because I was trying to help her think through how we solve this problem. We grew a bunch of plants, extra plants, that we normally would grow for our balconies, and started to give it away to people. And we felt good when, the community rallied. They would come back and say, hey, I'm going to give away as well. Do you want some plants? And it became this small movement that we felt really proud about, but felt like we could control some small part of this problem, and we could tackle some part of the problem. And that's where the passion for sustainability really came about. And it's grown from there. A lot of my own personal angel investment now goes into this space. So really my areas where I think about legacy today is sustainability and equality in society. for women and for others.
And we know that there's sort of intersectionality between the two. So I'd love to explore a little bit more about that. But I know that of you, your passion for sustainability. And when you're talking, I'm hearing kind of, okay, there's something in my life, in the areas of my life that really matter. Now I'm going to go about thinking about how I can bring that to life a little bit more. What can we do together? And so what is it about, if we look at the sustainability part, the planet, because you did a TED talk about this recently, not that long ago, about sort of the power of one and the power of people doing their part. What are you hoping to see happen in your lifetime if people take a stronger position on the planet?
I think that everything starts with people caring. So awareness is a big part of this, and people realizing why they need to care is a big part of it. But my hope in my lifetime is that if there are communities that can be inspired by individuals who are able to articulate the problem or are able to get others to care enough about it, that collective action in different areas can come together, whether that is people growing food more sustainably or people making the right choices between buying one product versus another. It takes a bit of effort to go look at the label and say, is that locally produced or not? Is that manufactured sustainably or not? I will tell you, there are many rabbit holes that I go down when I'm buying groceries.
I can imagine.
It's like, oh, is it better to buy something in a Tetra Pak versus an aluminum can versus a glass bottle? I cannot tell you how long I spent on that problem. I think as someone in the corporate world, I also would love to see the corporate side of the world actually step in and say, why should it be so difficult for the consumer to make those choices, right? And I think corporates caring fundamentally about the planet is equally important and perhaps even more scalable on impact right away. And I think it's been interesting to see the investment world in the street in some ways stepping in and saying, hey, what's the ESG metric we should care about? I don't know if the street actually truly understands and deeply believes in sustainability, but I'll take it for now. I'll take throwing a question around ESG at the corporate world as a good start.
Yeah, I mean, any sort of progress here. And it's funny that you pivoted there, because as a global leader in a very large business, that's a very influential business as well. What are some of the ways that then you're pulling? I mean, I think that's a good example, but how are you pulling these intrinsic values that you have, these legacies that you want to live into then your leadership, into kind of the fabric of the organization that you're leading?
I think you've got to be authentic as a leader and bring your whole self into work, and people should know what you care about. But I think just being in a company which has a large global footprint, these are the conversations that we have internally as a company as well. What are we doing for the planet? How do we continually move our buildings to be using sustainable energy? How do we get our data centers to be more responsible in their carbon footprint? And those are very important conversations to have. But as Twitter, I also think there's another side to this, which is not only our own carbon footprint as a company, but also the platform and the ability to mobilize opinion and thought leadership through that. And so that's been really interesting to see play out. When Greta Thunberg at first started her climate strike movements, it played out on the platform in such a way that it was, in the year that it happened, it was the largest, most tweeted about conversation and hashtag. And that momentum around sustainability, we now see pervasive through the millennials on the platform, expressing that they would make the more responsible choices, asking brands to then join them and meet them where their consumption patterns are. So it's been really interesting to sit at that intersection of being a corporate that's thinking about how to be responsible ourselves and continually making strides there, but also being a platform that then can foster that community even further and that conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you point to the consumer also being part of pushing that, along, because it's interesting that sort of consumer-centric approach a lot more businesses are trying to take. And you said right at the start of that answer, you talked about you showing up authentically, you showing up and being clear about the things that matter for you. How have you built that muscle? Because it's not something that everyone has, and it's something that takes a lot. It takes a lot of work, I think. But what's your position on that, or how have you learned how to do that?
I think you're spot on. It takes a lot of work. I think it would be okay to say that. It would be honest to say that. It didn't come naturally to me at first. I sort of look at it as a muscle that you develop over time. And that comes from being inspired by other leaders who you see stand up and say, hey, I was wrong and we changed our mind and this is what we're going to try now because we made a mistake. Or, being able to see how your own teams respond when you are bringing your authenticity versus you're holding some restraint. And it's magical when you bring authenticity because you're able to actually move the needle emotionally much faster. People don't have to guess what you're thinking. People don't have to solve for that. It makes it more efficient, but it also makes it emotionally much more powerful. And that took some learning. I had a wonderful coach who I worked with. And part of my journey a few years ago was dropping that facade a little bit of being formal and being right and allowing myself to be a bit more authentic and just being myself. So it is a muscle. And that's good news, actually, because as a leader, you don't want to believe that you either have it or you don't, right? I think it's much more hopeful to say that you can learn it and you can actually develop that.
Yeah, it's funny that you frame it like that. It is. It's empowering to think, oh, well, this is just something else that I can learn, the competency that I can continue to strengthen. And you're being very humble, which is how I know you, and modest. And what Maya's not sharing is obviously this huge, not just leadership role that you're playing within Twitter on a global scale, but also you're involved in boards, you're an investor, you've touched on your angel investing. There's a lot in I would say that I'm always so amazed and inspired at how you fit all of these things in, and you're a parent and you've also got a husband who is also a dear friend of mine who also has a very, very significant career. And so I'm wondering how you have thought about designing your life so that you can fit all of these things that make you who you are in.
I think that has been the biggest puzzle, if you will, in life in the last few years. I think it's how do you have unfettered ambition and how do you have unfettered interests in life? And yet, how do you do it in a way where you can live with yourself at the end of the day on the balance that you achieve. Some days it's exhilarating, some days it's tiring. So we'll start there, that it is work in progress and all of that. But I think the most progress I've made with that is really trying to manage time and manage energy. And I have become someone that has needed to get super organized in life because I want all of these things. So, my mom looks at me now and laughs at me because she knew me as someone that was fairly, callous in how my things were and how my organization skills were. But now we have a meal plan on the fridge, pinned up by the weekend for the next whole week. We've got everything down to a schedule. But that's coping mechanism in some ways. I can't do it without that. Yeah. And so I've adapted and become a more organized person than I maybe truly have or care to be because I need to be that. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is actually constant prioritization. And every year I'll look back and, the kids and my husband and I do this exercise on what are the things we want to stop, start, and continue doing for ourselves as a family every New Year's, right? And so it's the alternate to New Year resolutions for us. But what is interesting is that every year I give myself permission to rebalance that portfolio in life because I need to have room. And I think it's more manageable when you think about it as a year at a time rather than saying I'm going to commit and make all these things and then do I get overwhelmed? Have there been years when I've got overwhelmed? Yes. But have there been years that I've pulled off everything I wanted to and said, I didn't think I could pull all this off, and I did. So I think organization skills, prioritization, and then holding some things sacred. For me, those are dinners with the kids and weekends with the family. Those are sacred. And, I don't work on the weekends. I'm always back from travel when I used to be traveling on the weekends. No matter how far I go, I'm always back with the kids on the weekends. And so knowing for your own true north, what you are willing to trade off versus not makes it easier because you won't trade off A or B and you are willing to trade off C or D.
Yeah, it's so beautifully expressed because it's bringing together these two ideas. That one part of it is really curating and saying what are the things that we want and how do we want this to look really at the outset, which is really, I would describe as sort of designing your strategy around your vision and the things that matter to you. And then the other is just very practical. Like, how do you actually habitualize and create routines and rhythms? And I love that you describe these areas as things that are sacred, things that can't be kind of or won't be touched. So there's lots of things that you are then thinking about in a really practical way and making sure that they're present in your life. How do you said something like you dial things up or dial things down? So how do you make those kind of assessments in the moment, just very practically speaking?
When I started being an angel investor, as an example, it was exhilarating. It's such an exciting thing to meet founders and to learn ideas and things like that. And then you realize the more founders you meet, the more number of companies you're assessing, the more legal documents you're assessing. And then on one hand, I'm saying my weekends are sacred with my kids. So how do those two things actually sit with each other, right? And so where it's easy and where it's flexible, I dial things up and down. I decided I definitely want to support founders, and I dial it up when I have the time and when the kids are busy with other things. But hey, there might be some really good deals I had to pass on because I just didn't have the time to get through it all. And so I think building that mindset of flexibility as you go in and telling people as well that, hey, I'm a weekend investor. So you may not hear from me during the week. I may not have a chance to look at these things at pace. And if you're trying to close the investment round within a couple of weeks, I may not be able to match your timelines. And I'm very upfront with all the founders I meet in that sense. But also thinking about how I run my teams and my organizations at work, they all know upfront how I prioritize my time, what my style is. And I know theirs too with my direct reports. And so I think that really helps when you have that level of transparency and you're not keeping each other guessing, that you're able to dial things up and down. And you also have a transparent relationship. So if I'm going through something at home, I'll tell my team saying, hey, you may not hear from me for a while. And if you need to make those decisions, move forward unless you really, really need an opinion, but keep moving forward, right? And so it's that type of transparency upfront with a mindset of flexibility that helps me survive through these.
Yeah, it's funny because as you're talking about transparency and flexibility and agility, and I'm also thinking, and I don't know if you would characterize it like this, so please don't let me put words in your mouth. Correct me if it's not true, but it also feels like a refreshing approach to perfectionism also from the point of view of like, sometimes, in order for me to be flexible, I also need to kind of release this idea that that everything is going to be perfect or I'm going to be completely buttoned up, which we know is a strong narrative for females and for female leaders. How do you resonate to that? Or what's your reaction to that? And I suppose, like, what have you done to manage that?
Yeah, it's super intuitive that you picked up on that, Bex. Super intuitive. I genuinely think that perfectionism is something that we've got to fight in some ways, not just women leaders, but yes, there's a lot of that in women leaders. I certainly used to be someone that was like that. Many years ago, the joke was that every time I built a slide deck to present to someone, I would touch it 50, 100 times before it was just right. And I used to take pride in the fact that my slides were visual and yet not not overrun by text, but it took a long time to get it there. And one of the first things that I worked with my own coach on in recent years was how to accept good enough. And it changed my life in a number of ways because, I think it's kind of turning the mirror from within you to put it ahead in front of you to look at and say, hey, this is what people outside of me are seeing as my output rather than just my own perception of my output. And I think that changes the mindset quite a lot. And, you don't feel amazing at the end of every single attempt that you do, like a presentation or something else or a big speech you do. But at the same time, you're like, hey, that had pretty good impact. And maybe that's okay. I didn't kill myself over it and I still can do some of these other things. It's a life-changing concept to be able to say, I'm okay with good enough. And I definitely encourage everybody to try that and to actually find your own version of that. Maybe you experiment with it and you find your own version of how that works for you. But I'm a huge believer in this. And it's very intuitive for you to sort of pick on that.
Well, I mean, thank you for being so honest about it as well. And I resonate so strongly with this and have had my own journey around it as well. And actually, I'm pretty sure that your husband, Hari, was the first one that introduced me to this sort of like 80-20 Pareto principle. Like, what's the benefit of going that extra 20% of the way? And I think about it a lot. But it's also like all of these things that we're describing, it takes a confidence and a self-belief to go there, I think. And also a muscle. We've talked about the muscle of authenticity. For me, it's also a muscle to build and to strengthen over time. So thank you for being honest about that. And you said it's changed your life. So now I'm just curious, like in what ways has this really, helped you?
Look, I think it changed my life because more than the time that it saved me, it allowed me to be comfortable with who I am, rather than constantly judging and pulling my own output apart and saying, I could have done this better, I could have done that better. The mental burden and the mental tax that attempting to be a perfectionist used to put on me was exhausting sometimes. And so it's that liberation and it's that freedom of saying, my brain doesn't hurt all the time and I can actually live with myself.
Exactly. I could be quiet for a minute in my mind.
So that is honestly the biggest benefit in all of this, right? And of course, the side benefit is that, it helps you manage your time better and it helps you prioritize better where you want to put your energy. So I think those are really good things. But for me, it all starts from just being able to be comfortable with what I did and happy with what I did and just, go through my day without questioning and cross-questioning it inside my own brain.
Yeah, it's so perfect that you mentioned this inside your own brain, because the reason this is called Not Just Anything is because this belief that we are multi-dimensional, multifaceted humans, and yet we still can create stories in our own brains about what we are and what we aren't and what we should and what we shouldn't, if we are enough, if we aren't enough. How would you describe where you are with that today? Like you said, obviously, that was a big part of quietening those voices. But do you ever have moments of sort of doubt, and how do you overcome that?
Oh, yeah. Always. I think it comes from the fear of failure in some ways, right? The fear of judgment of failure. And do I have doubts in my mind? Absolutely. All the time. But I think it's a question of, do you let that consume you? Or consume many hours of the day worrying and fretting about it and then creating stress in your life? Versus do you give it a few moments to think and say, could I do this differently? Could I do this better? Can I learn from it? And then be able to move on to something else and rather than dwell on it. I think that's where I have seen that life-changing effect come into play. I will worry about whether a meeting went the way I wanted it to go. Did I get the outcome I wanted? But I think it's the ability to not dwell on it, which is probably the biggest. I think the other thing that helps in this framework of self-doubt or fear is taking a long-term view rather than a short-term view. If you are just able to expand that time horizon of when you want to get to your results and the achievements you want, and not necessarily put all the burden on this one meeting or this one instance when you needed to show up, then you sort of feel like, it's a step in the right direction. And I have another 4 steps to take before I really need to worry about, is it judgment day and have I achieved what I wanted? And so it becomes a learning step in the process rather than a be-all moment in some sense, right? And so I think in most cases in life, that principle works. So just adding a bit of time to by when do you need to achieve some of the things that you have in your own head as goalposts also helps in that process.
Yeah, I could see how that kind of setting that context would really help. And at the same time, I'm wondering for somebody like you that has this, what did you say? Unfettered ambition, I think is the phrase that you used earlier. So how do you manage that for yourself when you've got this like kind of, okay, place this in the context of the big picture. And at the same time, I want to, I'm pushing, I want to be able to do these things.
That's the adrenaline rush I'm on.
Got it. This is your fuel. Is this the energy that we're talking about?
It is. But I think it's funny, but Hari and I, and you know Hari really well, and we know each other through Hari, my husband, but he and I have had this friendship and this parallel life that we have led. We met when we were very, very young. And so we would set all these goalposts for ourselves. And there was this joke. I don't know if he wants me to tell you this or not, but anyway, it's going to be in public forum. But he would always, as a young, very confident young guy, he'd be like, oh, I want to be VP by 30, right? I want to make VP by 30. And I would be like, oh man, like, do we have to put these goalposts? But it became this fun game we would play with each other and say, oh, what's the next goalpost we can put and how can we help each other get there? When we actually got out of this joking, brash, confident mode, but into just a more pragmatic mode, we actually decided to see what we wanted in 5-year, 10-year increments in life, rather than I want to get to this next job or I want to get to this, to achieving X or Y, right? And so I think going back to that time horizon being a bit longer really helps. And so even if I am ambitious, I am learning to be ambitious on a longer time horizon rather than say, I need to do this by this year or by next year. And I think that helps because it gives you room to say, do I really want it? I think I want this as the next goalpost, but do I really want it? Do I really care about it? Are there other ways of achieving it? And so you get to experiment a bit. So I definitely think this slightly longer horizon planning has helped us be ambitious, but at the same time, give us room to live our life without being consumed by that ambition and only be blinded by that one thing when we are trying to live this whole life of other things too.
Oh, it's so powerful. And thank you for sharing that. And it's amazing because you are both, I mean, there's no sort of greater couple goals that I can think of in my own network and than you and the family that you have and what you've both been able to achieve, which is amazing. And it doesn't surprise me then that there was that little bit of like healthy competition to maybe at the start to get there. And so I suppose for you, because you work with a lot of founders, because I know you mentor a lot of people, and because we have a platform here to talk to a cross section of society, what are some of the things, the messages that you want people to kind of take away or think about, or mantras, advices, things that you live by?
The few things that I live by, I actually think without constraints. I love that. I think you think as wide as you can, you dream as big as you can, and then you apply the constraints of pragmatic life. But it's amazing when that happens and when that comes about. I think the second piece that I sort of live by is just being curious and being as widely curious as possible. One of the things that I found is just using serendipity to read books that you wouldn't normally read, or using serendipity to discover podcasts that you would never listen to, but then walk away with the gem of a concept from completely some other topic that you wouldn't have touched on that you could then apply. And that leads to a tremendous amount of innovation. And it's, there's a lot of research that came out of Wharton that talks about combining ideas from different places actually accelerates innovation. The third thing I would leave behind is just knowing what you care about for this world and making sure that anything you build also contributes to that purpose in some ways, whether that is diversity, whether that is income inequality, whether that is just putting time back in people's lives. But I think this world needs a lot more of founders and ideas and innovation that has a really true purpose and a true north behind it. We often look at founders and say that there are some missionary entrepreneurs and they're mercenary entrepreneurs, and they're both good and they both create amazing economic value in the world. But how amazing would it be to have, people who have both those skill sets built in one, right? And that's the dream. If you're able to bring that in some ways, your whole self as a founder, that would be amazing to see.
And it's a perfect circle right back to the start, because it's this fusion of kind of like, the creative side that you articulated right at the start, and also this sort of like more pragmatic and in all of these different aspects. I think that's a perfect place for us to end. So I just want to say a massive, massive thank you for being so open and honest, and for letting me push you a little bit, and at the same time for being so authentic about you and your journey. I think it's incredibly inspiring, and I'm sure that the listeners will get a lot out of your ideas for how they can show up and what you've done to create this amazing life that you have. So thank you.
Thank you. Such a good conversation. Despite being friends and knowing each other so well, I feel like it was so nice to talk to you, and just more layers I learned even about you and your intuition. So nice.
Thank you so much for joining me today for another episode of Not Just Anything for Women Who Want It Whole. If you enjoyed our discussion, be sure to subscribe to our weekly podcast and leave us a review. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here with us, and we look forward to having you join again. And remember, be brave, be whole, be you.